Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to break down one of criminal law's most fascinating and complex areas, the heat of passion defense. We're going to give you a super clear framework to really nail the difference between murder and manslaughter.
Here's how we'll do it. First, we'll frame the basic conflict, then we'll get into the 4 hurdles rule, which is the key analytical tool. We'll see how to apply it, chart out the possible outcomes, and then lock in the big takeaway. Ready? Let's go.
All right, first up, let's set the stage. What's the fundamental conflict we're trying to resolve here?
This right here, this is the whole reason voluntary manslaughter exists as a legal concept. It's this middle ground, you know? The law created it for killings that are intentional, yeah, but just don't feel like a full-blown murder. They're not bad enough for a murder conviction, but they're way too bad to be let off the hook completely.
So what the law is really doing is recognizing that sometimes an extreme emotional disturbance can kind of lower a person's moral blame for an intentional killing. It's not an excuse, right? And it's not a justification. It's what we call a mitigation.
So, that brings us to the really precise legal issue a court has to wrestle with anytime a defendant says, "Hey, I acted in the heat of passion."
And this is the key to your analysis. Every single heat of passion case, it all boils down to answering this one question.
So, how do courts actually answer that question? Well, they use a very specific 4-part test. I want you to think of them as 4 hurdles that a defendant has to clear to get a murder charge knocked down to manslaughter. Let's see what they are.
Yep, think of these like 4 gates in a row. To get that mitigation from murder down to manslaughter, a defendant has to successfully pass through all 4 of them. If they fail even one, the outcome changes completely.
Okay, now for what I think is the most important part, the analysis. This is where the rubber meets the road. It's how you take that 4-part rule and actually apply it to a real situation.
The first hurdle is completely objective, and that's critical. It's not about what provoked this specific defendant. The question a court asks is, would the provocation be enough to make a reasonable person lose their normal self-control?
Now this quote here is fantastic because it clarifies the standard perfectly. See, the law is not saying that a reasonable person would kill in that situation. Absolutely not. What it's saying is that the killer's loss of self-control is at least understandable, given the circumstances. The act is still a crime, for sure, but we're looking at it through a lens of human frailty. You know, back in the day, courts were really rigid about this stuff. They basically created these legal pigeonholes, and if your case didn't fit neatly into one of these categories, well, you were probably out of luck. But, you know, the law's moved on. Instead of those strict categories, the modern trend is to give juries a lot more flexibility to decide what's reasonable. Take the old mere words rule. It used to be an absolute. Words alone could never be enough. But now, courts get that some words, like a sudden, shocking confession, can hit just as hard as a physical punch.
And this slide perfectly captures a huge tension in modern criminal law. On one side, you have the traditional common law, which uses a purely objective, reasonable person. It doesn't care if the defendant is unusually jumpy or was drunk. But on the other side, you've got the model penal code, which has influenced a ton of laws. It brings in some subjectivity, asking the jury to consider the actor's situation, which can open the door to thinking about personal circumstances.
Okay, so once you clear that first big objective hurdle, the next 3 are this really interesting mix of subjective and objective tests. They dig into what was actually going on in the defendant's head and then compare it back to that reasonable person standard. Let's break these down real quick. Hurdle 2 is subjective. Was this defendant actually provoked? We're trying to get inside their head. But then, hurdle 3 snaps right back to being objective. Would a reasonable person have had enough time to cool down? It doesn't matter if this defendant was still seeing red, we're looking at a reasonable amount of time. And finally, hurdle 4 is subjective again. Did this specific defendant actually cool off? Because even if only a minute passed, if they regained their cool and then decided to kill, that's murder. All right, let's put it all together now. This is how clearing or failing these 4 hurdles points you directly to the final criminal charge. Okay, this table is basically your cheat sheet for the whole analysis. If the defendant gets past all 4 hurdles, it's voluntary manslaughter. But look at how it splits. If they fail the objective hurdles, 1 or 3, it usually points to second-degree murder. The rage was real, but it was legally unreasonable. Now, if they fail the subjective hurdles, 2 or 4, that shows the defendant was acting in cold blood. And that cold-blooded state of mind, that's what can elevate the crime to first-degree murder. So, after all of that,
What's the one big, overarching principle that this whole doctrine teaches us about homicide?
Here it is. Voluntary manslaughter is not an excuse. It's not a justification. It's the law basically making a concession to human frailty. It's acknowledging that a person's moral guilt is just less when they kill in response to an understandable, extreme emotional disturbance. The law never says the killing was okay, but it does admit that human passion can be a powerful and sometimes overwhelming force.
And that leaves us with one last thing to think about. As you use this framework, it's worth asking yourself, does a rule that came about in an era of duels, fixed death penalties, and pretty rigid ideas of honor, does it still serve justice today? That's a question the law is still grappling with, and it's definitely something worth chewing on.